August 1945. The Japanese Empire lies in ruins. American soldiers move through shattered cities. Through abandoned depots and bunkers, the Japanese army spent years building for a final battle that never came. Inside those depots, they find thousands of Arisaka rifles, Type 96 and Type 99 machine guns, Nambu pistols, the weapons of an army that once controlled vast stretches of Asia and the Pacific. But among all of it, something stands out. Compact, rare, almost unknown even to many Japanese soldiers themselves. A weapon that looks like Japan's attempt to build its own version of a European submachine gun. A long perforated barrel shroud, a magazine mounted on the side, a complicated design that arrived far too late. This is the Type 100, Japan's only mass-produced submachine gun of the Second World War. A weapon meant to give the Japanese army an edge in close combat. A weapon that showed up at the exact moment Japanese industry could no longer meet even the basic needs of the war. This isn't the story of a weapon that changed the course of a war. It's the story of a weapon that exposed just how far modern warfare had moved and how hard it was for Japan to catch up. Because by the time the Type 100 finally reached the battlefield, the war looked nothing like what its designers had pictured back in the early 1930s. At the start of the war, the Japanese army looked very different from the armies of the US, the Soviet Union, and Germany. While other nations were racing to develop submachine guns, Japanese command treated them as a secondary weapon for years. The reasoning came down to doctrine. The rifle was the infantryman's primary weapon. Japanese officers built their tactics around discipline, marksmanship, and the bayonet charge. A soldier carrying a Type 38 or Type 99 rifle was the backbone of a Japanese infantry squad. Automatic weapons were viewed differently. The army already had light machine guns, the Type 96, later the Type 99. But the idea of individual automatic weapons for every soldier wasn't seen as necessary for a long time. That put Japan out of step with everyone else. In Germany, the MP-38 and MP-40 became essential tools for mechanized units. In the Soviet Union, the PPSh-41 rolled off production lines by the millions. In the US, the Thompson, and later the M3, became standard for close quarters fighting. Japan only saw the need for a submachine gun once the Pacific War showed what modern combat actually looked like. Island battles, jungle warfare, attacks at point-blank range, fighting through trenches and bunkers. There, a long rifle became a liability. Soldiers were engaging the enemy at a few dozen meters, sometimes less. And in that kind of fight, a compact automatic weapon was a massive advantage. Japan had studied the submachine gun concept even before the war began, watching European designs, especially German and Italian models. One early effort was the Type 68 submachine gun, but it never went anywhere. The army wasn't convinced the weapon was worth the investment. There was also a supply problem. Japanese industry already produced pistol ammunition for the Nambu handguns, but nothing on the scale of a proper submachine gun cartridge, like Germany's 9x19mm Parabellum. Japan kept using its own 8mm Nambu round, a cartridge built for pistols, underpowered compared to what other nations were feeding their submachine guns. It suited a compact weapon, but it couldn't match the punch of foreign designs. By the late 1930s, though, things were shifting. Fighting in China showed Japanese commanders that close-range automatic fire was becoming critical, especially for paratroopers, tank crews, scouts, and units operating in difficult terrain. That's when work began on a new Japanese submachine gun, the Type 100. The design work fell to the Kokura Arsenal, one of Japan's main small arms production centers. Engineers tried to build something that actually matched what Japanese industry could realistically produce. The Type 100 was chambered for the 8x22mm Nambu cartridge and used a simple blowback action, a common, reliable system for submachine guns of the era. It had a wooden stock, a long barrel, and a perforated jacket around the barrel to protect the shooter. The 30-round magazine loaded from the left side, and that detail set it apart from almost every other submachine gun on the battlefield. Most contemporaries, the German MP-40, the Soviet PPSh, the American Thompson, fed from underneath. The side-mounted magazine made the weapon narrower for carrying, but it created real problems when firing from a prone position. The first version of the Type 100 appeared in the early 1940s, but production crawled forward at a painfully slow pace. And that's where Japan's real problem shows up. Engineers could build a working prototype. Mass production was a different challenge entirely. Japan simply didn't have America's industrial muscle. It couldn't run dozens of new weapons programs at once. Every new project competed for the same limited resources: rifles, machine guns, artillery, aircraft engines, ships, fuel. The Type 100 was never anywhere near the top of that list. By the time Japan went to war with the United States, the Army had only a small number of these weapons in service. The gun existed, it just wasn't out there. By the start of the Pacific War, Japan's arms industry was already in serious trouble, and not because of bad engineering. It was a problem of scale. Japanese designers could build effective weapons. Japanese factories couldn't build enough of them. Unlike the US, where entire plants churned out millions of small arms, Japan's military production was scattered across a handful of state arsenals. Many parts were still hand-fitted. Quality depended heavily on the skill of individual workers. As the war dragged on, things only got worse. By 1943 and 1944, Japan faced serious shortages: steel, machine tools, skilled labor. Experienced workers were being pulled into military service. Rolling out a new weapon under those conditions was brutally difficult. The Type 100 became a casualty of that reality. It was modern enough for its time, but it arrived in an army that could no longer afford to rearm on any real scale. Estimates vary, but historians generally put total production at somewhere in the low thousands. That's a rounding error next to what other countries built. The Soviet Union produced over 5 million PPSh-41s. Germany, more than 1 million MP-40s. The US, hundreds of thousands of Thompsons and over 600,000 M3 grease guns. Japan produced a small fraction of that. The Type 100 never became a standard issue weapon for Japanese infantry. It stayed rare. Limited numbers or not, the Type 100 did see action, mainly with units that genuinely needed a compact automatic weapon: paratroopers, Marines, special units, and vehicle crews. Japanese airborne troops were among its best-known users. A long rifle was awkward for a paratrooper. Jumping in required something lighter, something that let a soldier put out heavy fire the moment boots hit the ground. That's exactly where a submachine gun made sense. But even among paratroopers, the Type 100 wasn't common. Japan never built large-scale airborne forces the way Germany or the Soviet Union did, so demand for this kind of weapon stayed small. It also showed up in the island fighting across the Pacific. Brutal, close-range combat in jungles, cramped trenches, underground bunkers, night attacks. Exactly the conditions where an automatic weapon could make a real difference. But the numbers just weren't there. American units could field automatic weapons in bulk. Japanese soldiers, for the most part, were still carrying rifles. The Type 100 was the exception, not the rule. By 1944, the Japanese army was in dire shape. Losses across the Pacific were mounting. American forces were closing in on the home islands. Industry was under constant strain. That's when a new version of the Type 100 appeared, often called the late production model or the 1944 pattern. The goal was simple: make it cheaper and faster to build. The earlier version was too complex, too expensive for mass production. The new model simplified the sights, roughened the machining, and stripped out anything that wasn't strictly necessary. It was cruder, less refined. But that was exactly what Japan needed at that point. The problem is, even a simplified Type 100 showed up too late. By 1944, Japanese industry was in outright crisis. America held an overwhelming resource advantage. American bombers were hitting Japanese factories directly. The naval blockade was choking off raw materials. Japan had already moved past building the best possible weapon. It was now just trying to build something. The Type 100 became a symbol of that shift. It stopped being a modernization project. It became a weapon of desperation. It's worth comparing the Type 100 to its foreign counterparts, because on paper, Japan understood exactly why it needed this kind of weapon. It just never built the system to actually use it at scale. Doctrine. Japan clung to the rifle as the soldier's primary weapon for far too long, treating automatic fire as an afterthought. Germany and the Soviet Union had already learned from the First World War and the interwar conflicts just how much volume of fire mattered. Industry. A submachine gun only matters if you can build it by the thousands, by the tens of thousands, the millions. One good prototype changes nothing. Japan simply didn't have the capacity. Ammunition. The 8mm Nambu round was reliable enough for Japanese pistols, but it never matched the performance of 9x19mm Parabellum or .45 ACP. Lower power, more limited production, it capped what the weapon could do. Timing. When Germany fielded the MP-40, the war in Europe was just getting started. When the Soviet Union was churning out PPSh-41s by the million, it was gearing up for a long industrial war. When Japan tried to field the Type 100, its resources were already shrinking. It was trying to catch up at the exact moment it was falling further behind. Limitations aside, the Type 100 was a genuinely interesting piece of engineering, proof that Japanese designers understood the fundamentals of submachine gun design. It ran on straight blowback. Firing pressure pushes the bullet forward, while the bolt's mass and the recoil spring hold the action closed just long enough for a safe cycle. A simple, well-proven system used across most submachine guns of the era. The Type 100 fired in both semi-auto and full auto with a cyclic rate of roughly 450 rounds per minute, on the low side for the category. But that came with real upsides: easier control, better ammo economy, less muzzle climb. Barrel length ran around 230mm, overall length about 900mm. Unloaded weight, roughly 3.8 kilograms, heavy by today's standards, but ordinary for its time. The biggest weak point stayed the magazine. Side-mounted, unusual, something that took real getting used to. And on top of that, the magazines themselves were a separate manufacturing headache. In an industry already in crisis, every extra complicated part was one more thing that could go wrong. By 1945, the Type 100 had almost no ability left to influence the war. Japan was preparing to defend its own home islands, pulling together anything it could find: old rifles, training weapons, improvised gear. Things once considered inadequate were now treated as valuable. But the Type 100 stayed scarce. Most Japanese soldiers never even saw one. For the American troops going through Japanese depots after the surrender, this submachine gun was a strange find. A weapon that looked like an army trying to build something modern, but running out of time before it could finish. And that's the real tragedy of the Type 100. It wasn't a bad weapon. It wasn't a failed project. It just showed up in a country that was already losing the industrial war. Once the war ended, Japanese weapons scattered in every direction. Some destroyed, some sent to depots, some taken home as war trophies. A number of Type 100s ended up in the United States, and it's largely thanks to those trophies that surviving examples exist today. Collectors don't value the Type 100 because it was the most effective weapon of the war. They value it as a historical document. Every detail tells the story of a moment when Japan tried to rebuild its army. The shift from rifle-centered warfare toward automatic firepower, from craft production toward mass industry. That transition was never finished. Most legendary weapons of the Second World War carry a clean story of success. The PPSh is tied to the Soviet advance, the MP-40 to the early German campaigns, the M1 Garand to American infantry, the Browning M2 to American firepower generally. The Type 100 has no such legend. It's not tied to any victory. It never featured in a major turning point battle. Production was too small, use was too limited, but that's exactly what makes it worth talking about. The history of weapons isn't only the history of the winners. Sometimes the most revealing stories come from the ones that never changed anything. The Type 100 captures a moment when an old army tried to become modern and ran straight into limits that no single new design could fix. By 1944 and 1945, Japanese industry had shifted into a mode of extreme simplification across every weapon category. Rifles got rougher, finishing quality dropped, materials were rationed wherever possible, output mattered more than craftsmanship. Late production Type 100s reflect that shift directly. Early examples were carefully finished, later ones were crude. That wasn't a failure of the designers, it was the reality of total war. When a country runs out of resources, it has to choose. Build a small number of excellent weapons or a larger number of stripped down ones. Japan chose the second option, but even that decision came too late. By 1945, the number of Type 100s in circulation no longer mattered. A few hundred more submachine guns couldn't change the outcome. Japan's real problem was never a missing weapon category. It was facing an industrial system that no single technical fix could ever hope to beat. Today, the Type 100 is one of the rarest Japanese small arms of the Second World War. It's seldom seen in collections, and every surviving example carries real historical weight. But its significance goes beyond collecting. The Type 100 is a symbol of a modernization that never fully happened. A weapon that captures the contradiction at the heart of Japan's wartime industry. On one side, engineers capable of designing something genuinely modern. On the other, a system that couldn't produce it at scale. On one side, the ambition to catch up with modern armies. On the other, a doctrine that held on to the past for far too long. That's the real story of the Type 100. It didn't become a symbol of defeat because it was a bad weapon. It became one because it arrived in a country that was already losing the war. August 1945, Japanese soldiers laying down their weapons, rifles, machine guns, pistols, and every so often, a rare Type 100 among them, a weapon meant to be part of the Japanese Army's future, a future that no longer existed. This submachine gun landed right between two eras, between an old army built around the rifle and a new kind of war decided by volume of automatic fire. Between craft production and mass industry, between imperial ambition and what a country could actually afford. The Type 100 didn't change history, but it helps explain it, because sometimes one weapon can tell you more than an entire army ever could. Not just what a country was able to build, but what it could no longer afford to.